Is going on in Latin America, Code Pink's weekly YouTube program of hot news out of Latin America and the Caribbean. We broadcast every Wednesday at 4:30 p.m. Pacific, 7:30 p.m. Eastern. Tonight, we are going to focus again on the Caribbean island nation of Haiti. Last week, we brought to you an informative, activist-oriented conversation on Haiti and about the events surrounding February 7th and the refusal of President Jovenel Moïse to step down. Tonight, we are joined by Jake Johnston of Center for Economic Policy and Research. Most of you know this organization as CEPR, to discuss the Biden administration's policy on Haiti. Jake is a senior research associate at CEPR. At CEPR, his research has focused predominantly on economic policy in Latin America, the International Monetary Fund, and US foreign policy. He is the lead author of CEPR's Haiti Relief and Reconstruction Watch blog, and has authored papers on Haiti concerning the ongoing cholera epidemic, aid accountability and transparency, and the US foreign aid system. Welcome, Jake. So pleased you had time for us today.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start our conversation this evening with what happened in Haiti on February 7th, and briefly some of the events leading up to this catalyst of February 7th.
Yeah, sure thing. So, I mean, February 7th, I think, to begin with, is an extremely important date in Haiti's history, right? So this was the date in 1986 that baby Doc Duvalier fled into exile. And ever since, it has been the inauguration date of new presidents, right? And so it is a really important historical date. And the reason why this year was so important, and what we've seen in the last couple of weeks stemming from this, is a dispute over when the president's term actually ends, right? And so the president, and he has been backed in this interpretation by the United Nations, by the OAS, and by the US State Department, claims that his mandate extends until 2022. The opposition, and that is joined by myriad voices from Haiti civil society, including the Bar Association, different judicial organizations, the Catholic Church, et cetera, human rights organizations, have a different interpretation, and citing the Constitution say that it's quite clear, and in fact, his term ended this past February 7th. And so that is sort of the root of this crisis. Now, of course, that is only the sort of most proximate issue, right? And this has been something that has been developing for quite some time. And I think, we could sort of go back 100 years, 200 years, and sort of start from there.
300 years.
Right, exactly. But I think sort of most importantly to the current thing is, there have been protests calling for this president to resign and opposed to the government for many years, right? And so this has sort of come in ebbs and flows over the last couple of years, really starting in 2018, the summer of 2018, when the government implemented or tried to implement a hike to the gas prices as part of an IMF program. And that generated a significant response. And you've really seen that grow and sort of, again, ebb and flow and sort of have these different peaks really consistently from that moment.
So you mentioned the hike to gas prices. Is this an IMF austerity move for the country?
Yeah, that's right. And I think, this was something that it was announced very haphazardly and, it never actually went into effect because there was such a strong reaction from the streets immediately. But I think, what this issue highlighted was the role of government, and especially a real focus on how government was using its resources. And it really led to this consolidation of these issues around anti-corruption and good governance, right? And you saw throughout the summer of 2018 through 2019, this broad national movement for accountability and for, addressing these sort of issues at the core of the misgovernance that they had identified, right? And I think, what you're seeing today is really sort of, part and parcel of that real broad movement that developed in the aftermath of that in the last couple of years.
So for our audience, let's describe broad movement. This is more than just what we're seeing now is a majority, if I'm correct, of Haitian citizens protesting the current economic and governance of economic management and governance of their country. It's more than leftist, labor, union. It's more than that, correct?
Yeah, I think it's more than that. But I think here's a key thing that I think is really important in this discussion, right? I think the Haitian government, as well as the U.S. government, has a real interest in sort of framing this entire conflict as a fight for political power amongst two competing sides, right? Mm. And in doing so, they have erased the voices of civil society and grassroots organizations, which are not looking for anybody to pick a leader or pick who should be in power, but rather commit to principles and commit to actual systemic change, right? The actual issues that they want. I think that's where the focus needs to be, and that's where we in the international community and as outsiders can sort of try and shine that light, is what are these grassroots and civil society organizations looking for, right? Is this really just a fight for power, or is this something much broader? I think my own analysis is certainly informed by the myriad voices on the ground, is that this is something much broader. This is not just a fight for power. This is about something more systemic and more long-term.
So on February 7th, the U.S. State Department recognized, in a sense, Jovenel Moïse as president, stating, correct me if I'm wrong, stating that the U.S. would recognize him as president for one more year. Can you tell us what that statement was about, what the U.S. interest is in recognizing him for another year as president?
Yeah, well, I think there's a few points to make here. I mean, so in making that announcement, the State Department cited that they agreed with the OAS, right? And the OAS analysis, the Organization of American States, has cited quite frequently in the international community as sort of justifying this position. So I think there's a few sort of points that I'd like to make clarifying that to begin with, which is that this wasn't some institutional decision made by the OAS or based on some legal analysis or a vote of member states or anything like that. This was an analysis made by the Secretary General of the organization, Luis Almagro. Period. Right? That's it. And so to present it as broadly representative, or to give Secretary General Almagro that much credit or that much legitimacy, I think is a significant mistake, right? But also, I think is an important clarification, because I think what it reveals is that there is not such a monolithic view of this, right? Is that you can find actors in all of these institutions that have made these statements, but there are opportunities to push back and to sort of point out that this is not an institutional decision. This was the decision of the Secretary General, who at the time was looking for votes for his own re-election as Secretary General, right? So again, I think that sort of context is really important. It's easy to see, oh, well, the OAS said this, well, it must be good. But we have to look at actually what that decision was and who was a part of that. In terms of the US, right, and their real interests here, and I think this has been a consistent policy from the international community in the United States for many, many years, which is that it's a prioritization of short-term stability over anything else, right? And so for them to have, a chaotic transition that they aren't sure what would happen, that is the risk, that is the fear, right?
That they don't know what's going to happen.
Exactly. The policy with Haiti—
orchestrate the result.
The policy with Haiti is basically keep a lid on things, hope it stays out of the press, and hope for the best. Right? I mean, that has been international policy towards Haiti. Now, I think the result of that, it can be framed in terms of desire for short-term stability. I think what's clear is that the long-term impact of that is, in fact, greater instability.
Yeah, basically creating or continuing to give fuel to a powder keg, just tamping down the issues without resolving anything.
Right. And I think, in the current environment, you see a real focus on elections as the sole path out of that. And that's an appealing option, right? It's really difficult to say, oh, I'm opposed to elections, or elections aren't a proper expression of democracy, right? But again, I think we have to look and take a broader view of this, right? So the conflict over Jovenel Moïse's mandate, right? It stems from an election in which 18% of Haitian people participated. He was elected with just under 600,000 votes in a country of 11 million people. An election like that is not going to produce stable governance. It's not going to produce long-term, a representative government. It's just not, right? And so
it's a government in name only.
And so basically, to think that holding, elections, and there's a whole lot more problems today than there were 5 years ago in terms of organizing elections and having them be credible. But even just a repeat of what we saw last time, we're going to find ourselves in the exact same position in a few years from now. And I think for a lot of policymakers internationally, that's okay, right? It's kicking the can down the road and covering themselves for the short term. Of course, that's not in the interest of Haiti. It's not in the interest, I think, of the long-term interest of the United States or the international community writ large.
For the United States, what does Haiti represent? What is the role? For me personally, you mentioned kicking the can down the road, solving issues, or quote unquote, solving issues through elections. Nothing is really fundamentally or structurally being changed. And over the years, it doesn't seem like the United States really wants anything to fundamentally change in Haiti. What is this, this policy towards Haiti today with the United States? How does that affect other Caribbean island nations and perhaps Latin America as a whole?
Yeah, well, I think here it's really important to sort of go back into history a little bit, right? And obviously Haiti's role as, a successful slave revolt creating this republic, right? I mean, in 1804 to abolish slavery, the first country in the world, and they paid for that, right? They sent a message of hope to the world, and they paid for it. They paid for it dearly, right? And that was a very long thing, right? Of paying indemnity to France for their freedom,
buying themselves back from the French.
Right? We know this history, and we know the history of the U.S. occupation in the early 20th century, consolidating power in Port-au-Prince, rewriting the Constitution. I mean, you've got centuries of that history at play. But I think what people have often missed in Haiti in the contemporary environment is that what we see right now is really part of a 30-year effort of nation building on the part of international actors in Haiti, right? So you had Haiti's first democratic election in 1990, and the liberation theologian and priest, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, wins this huge democratic uprising, this mass movement, real hope. Again, similar, a hope to the hemisphere at this time, right? This was the time when the hemisphere was, under these neoliberal governments, sort of winding down of some military dictatorships. This was, again, a hope to the hemisphere, a hope to the world about what could happen, right? What you could do through political change here. And again, Haiti has paid for that, right? It paid for that most immediately. Aristide was overthrown 9 months later, right? A military junta took over and began to systematically exterminate those grassroots actors that had led to that historic change, right? And what you've seen since is international actors in coordination with local political and economic elite in Haiti, right? I think it's really important to know that international actors don't just operate alone. They operate with allies, and that's a really important aspect of this all. But I think, again, from an outsider's perspective and from us as people in the national community, we're looking to change our government's policies, right? And so focusing on their role in this all. And again, I think what it's best described as is trying to sort of put the guardrails on Haitian democracy, right? And this was started in the mid-1990s, and I think really has continued since, where the limits of what is acceptable to the international community is tightly defined, right? And that has resulted in, over time, in my opinion, right, a government and electoral system of democracy that has lost connection to the actual historic grassroots and civil society organizations and the Haitian people writ large that it needs to be representative of, right? And so, again, with these elections, low turnout elections, where winners or legitimacy are imposed by foreign actors, right? This is not going to produce some sort of representative or sustainable government. And I think what we need to reckon with is that this isn't just an isolated thing today. This is part of a many-year-long plan. And the plan, people talk about Haiti as a failed state, right? I mean, I like to talk about Haiti as an aid state, right? I mean, this is a government that and system that is shaped by foreign actors, extremely shaped by foreign actors. And I think we have to, again, as internationals, we have to focus on that as well, because the role of those international actors is what we as outside actors can actually, be focused on and be trying to change.
So talking about focusing on what the international community is doing and what we as US citizens can do, tell us what's happening now in Washington, D.C. You're involved in some of the work on the Hill that's pushing back against this current, it's not a new position, but this reinforcement of US involvement in Haiti, recognition of Moïse as continuing to recognize him as president. What's happening on the Hill now in, what's the word I want? I'm speaking in Spanish half the time here in Mexico City, so I want to say contra. Biden administration or countering the Biden administration and State Department's position. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I think that's
my
right.
vocabulary
so,
there.
You know, as you mentioned earlier, right, the State Department, you know, came out in support of Moise's, you know, extension of Moise's mandate. And that weekend, you had statements from Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont, pushing back on that very strenuously, saying, it's clear the term has ended. You know, we need condemning sort of the repression and things like that we've been seeing in recent weeks and months and years. And you've also had a group of members of the House, led by Gregory Meeks, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, but also, you know, Yvette Clarke and Representative Andy Levin, who I think is probably the only member of Congress who speaks fluent Creole and has a long history in the country. Again, sort of presenting, you know, some pushback on that. And I think this is really important because obviously this is happening at a time when you have a transition in administrations here in the United States, right? And so there's a lot of questions about what is the new administration? What is the Biden administration's policy with regard to Haiti? You know, and so I think what we've actually seen so far, you know, on the one side is a lack of preparation, at the very least, on the Biden administration, that they didn't have anybody actually focused or looking at Haiti from the jump. And I think, you know, that clearly was a mistake.
That's a statement in and of itself, right?
Right, exactly. And I think an important one. And I think so for the time being, you know, my impression is really that the policy is being led by the U.S. Embassy in Port-au-Prince and in the Ambassador Michelle Sisson. Now, that's, again, deeply problematic given the, you know, impression, and I think well-deserved impression, that she has been extremely close to the Haitian president for many years now, in her 3 years in Haiti. And so the credibility of the embassy and these actors, these international actors in Haiti are so low that sort of continuing with them trying to run this policy would be a real mistake, right? And so I think Congress right now has a huge role to play, and the administration is caught on the back foot. They don't really know what they're doing. They don't have a plan. And so it's going to be up to Congress, who does have a role in setting U.S. foreign policy, to push back and ensure that this administration is actually paying attention to what's happening in Haiti.
Well, this seems to me like, by default, an incredible opening in U.S. Haitian policy. I mean, there's this void that Congress can now basically walk into and perhaps fill with some new ideas. And particularly, you mentioned Leahy, Meeks, and Levin. Those are, I mean, most of us progressives are pretty excited to see their voices in Congress. So can you tell us a bit about what they are doing in Congress and how activists and their own constituents can perhaps help push their perspective forward?
Yeah, and I mean, you know, in addition to those people, and I think it's great to have, you know, leadership like that. And I just want to sort of give a shout out to so many other offices that have led on Haiti issues for so long. Maxine Waters, Frederica Wilson, right? I mean, Barbara Lee, Yvette Clarke. I mean, there is a tremendous interest there. There's a tremendous history there. The Congressional Black Caucus has played such an important role in the history of shaping U.S. policy in Haiti. You know, and I think there is, you know, again, I mean, Haiti is back in the news, right? And sadly, it's when Haiti is in the headlines that people in the U.S. start paying attention, right? And policymakers start paying attention. You know, I think that's maybe a different discussion and something, you know, that
no, I'd love to have you come back
right?
and talk about that. But that's kind of how U.S. politics,
right. And so, you know, the reality is right now there is focus on that, right? And there is interest. And so I think, you know, the most important thing, right, is that Haitian voices are heard in Congress, right? So that they can actually hear from civil society organizations, from the grassroots groups that are, you know, fighting for their life, like quite literally, right? I mean, these people have been protesting, they've been repressed. I mean, this has been a really dangerous situation for a number of years with rising insecurity and kidnappings. And so, again, I think trying to elevate those voices and getting in there. And I think, again, what's really important is trying to, you know, reframe this not as a political fight or looking to get politicians in the U.S. to choose sides in a political fight. And the U.S. shouldn't be interpreting Haiti's constitution as a principle, right? I mean, it's not up to us, right, to interpret Haiti's constitution. What we can do is commit to principles, and we can stand in solidarity with grassroots organizations and civil society organizations that are actually doing the work and trying to create the space to change their country and to better their lives, right? And I think that's what we, you know, internationally can try and do. And I think trying to get that message to members of Congress, right? And just making sure that members are looking at this, that their constituents, that their, you know, voters care about what the U.S. is doing in Haiti and care about U.S. policy in Haiti, right? And so I think, again, you know, just getting this onto people's radar, I think, and raising awareness around these issues, I think, is an extremely important step here.
In getting this onto people's radars, are there any particular projects our viewers can get involved in? I know I personally am working with a new coalition called US-UN out of Haiti, and we are circulating an organizational sign-on letter. And we'll be sure I can post that in the comment section of our broadcast as well. Is there anything that you can encourage our viewers to participate in as well? Phone calls, sign-on letters,
again,
meetings?
I mean, I think, you know, calling members and calling their staff and saying, hey, what's going on in Haiti? What are you doing about Haiti? Are you looking at this? I think that's really important. I think, you know, down the line, I'm sure there will be more sort of direct actions that can be taken, right? You know, whether it's sign-on letters or different actions targeted Congress or briefings or other things like that we can all sort of lift up and support and try and drive attention to. You know, and again, I think this is all happening at a time with so much else going on in Congress and in Washington and with COVID. I mean, it's difficult. And so again, you know, it's just getting this onto the agenda, right? And now I think there's another point here though that's really important, right? Because getting Haiti onto the agenda or looking for the US to change policy is very different than looking for the US to intervene, right? Or to take a more direct role like that, right? And I think there is a concern that as this situation continues, international actors will look to, you know, resolve the situation or step in to try and mediate or negotiate. And I think that is a real concern in some regards, in that a lot of the actors who might be looking to do that, the OAS, the US, the UN, have been extremely discredited, right? And so they aren't in a position to actually do that. Not to mention they have their own interests and agendas in Haiti, which directly conflict with what we're hearing from civil society organizations. And so I think, you know, there is a real line to be drawn there where, again, it's not looking for the US to intervene. It's not looking for the US to overthrow the government. What it is looking for the US to be clear about its neutrality in a sovereign issue, right? And I think that is the, you know, what is most appropriate for international actors and certainly US policymakers to be doing is again, committing to principles, right? I mean, I think, you know, if you look at US foreign policy, right, in general, we don't have principles, right? We talk about principles, but we don't. We have interests, right? And we protect those interests.
Human rights interests.
Of course. And so I think, you know,
the irony of that.
Again, like, let's hold ourselves to some principles here, right? I think that's what's most important.
So let's before I let you go, let's talk briefly about the OAS, because you've mentioned the OAS and Luis Almagro specifically a couple times. And we've seen the OAS intervene in the Bolivia presidential elections, November of 2019, of which CEPR wrote a fantastic report on OAS intervention in Bolivia. We are now seeing perhaps another episode of OAS intervention in the upcoming second round of presidential elections in Ecuador. And now you have mentioned the OAS in its machinations in Haiti. So yeah. We see this Organization of American States really overtly so, manipulate the complexion of the hemisphere.
Yeah, I think this is an extremely important thing in terms of what the future policy of a Biden administration is going to be, right? We've heard a lot from the Biden administration about this return to multilateralism. Mm-hmm. Well, if the premier multilateral organization in the hemisphere is run by an ideologue who is supporting coups and, you know, leading, what kind of return to multilateralism is that, right? So, you know, the idea that the OAS can really play a helpful role in this hemisphere or have any credibility with Almagro at its head, I think is, you know, sort of blind to the past. And I think this is going to be a huge thing for the Biden administration to confront, right? Are they going to work with Almagro and to do this? Because if they are, then we're going to see a continuation of the policies that we saw in the past under the Trump administration, right? And I think, again, policy in Haiti is largely bipartisan, right? We don't see huge shifts from Democrats to Republicans. It's again, but I think, and certainly in this current environment, it was Democrats in power in, previously that sort of helped the rise of the current political party in Haiti reach power in the first place. So both parties have their hands, in the middle of this. But I think it is really important in terms of, our messaging that like Biden is campaigning on this sort of clean break from the Trump years, right? To sort of change this trajectory and to restore the soul and dignity of America. Well, there is no better place to start than Haiti, right? I mean, there is no better place
for the entire hemisphere
actually expose like what our soul is about. Like how are we going to look at Haiti? How are we going to perceive Haiti? How are we going to treat Haiti and Haitians, right? I think this is extremely important. And unless, there's a clear policy shift and I think also a clear effort on the part of the administration to confront the, those entrenched interests within the OAS, within the UN, it's going to be very difficult to see a real shift in policy.
So before I let you go, let me say I'd really love to have you come back and talk about multilateralism in the hemisphere. This is a theme that keeps coming up, this unilateralism versus multilateralism. And I would argue the world already is functioning under a multilateral paradigm, more or less, with the US pushing back or the US wanting to clearly define multilateralism in its own terms. And so I would love to have you come back and talk about that. And I'm so thankful that you had time for us today. I know you have a very, very busy schedule, and I'm so thankful you were able to make time for this conversation. And so I want to just remind our audience that you've been listening to Jake Johnston of Center for Economic Policy and Research, and that you can catch our broadcast, What the F is Going On in Latin America, every Wednesday on Code Pink YouTube, 4:30 p.m. Pacific, 7:30 p.m. Eastern. So thanks a lot, Jake. So happy to have you on the show this evening.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.